Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 11 of our reading of Alfred Hitchcock Presents Stories Not for the Nervous. And we are going to go over the copyright information, which should be on your screen right now. It says here that the author gratefully acknowledges the invaluable assistance of Robert Arthur in the preparation of this volume. It also gives all of the information here, all of the copyright information, all the different publishings and stuff like that. So, also, we're going to put the acknowledgments up on the screen. I will not be reading them aloud, but they will be up on the screen while I read this book. Now, we will be starting. Let's see. In the last part, we finished off The Dog Died First. Then we read the... Okay, we finished off The Dog Died First by Bruno Fisher. Then we read The 20 Friends of William Shaw next. And now we will be reading The Other Hangman by Carter Dickson. Looks like it's a rather large story, so we're probably not going to get through it all in this reading. But let's see. The Other Hangman by Carter Dickson. Why do they electrocute him instead of hanging him in Pennsylvania? What? I said my old friend, Judge Murchison, dexterously hooking the spittoon closer with his foot. Do they teach you in these newfangled law schools anyway? Because that, son, was a murder case. It turned the Supreme Court whiskers gray to find a final ruling, and for 30 years it's been argued about by lawyers in the back room of every saloon from here to the Pacific coast. It happened right here in this county when they hanged Fred Joliffe for the murder of Randolph Frazier. It was in 92 or 93. Anyway, it was the year they put the first telephone in the courthouse and you could talk as far as Pittsburgh, except when the wires blew down. Considering it was the county seat, we were mighty proud of our town. Population 3,500. The hustlers were always bragging about how thieving and growing our town was. How thriving and growing our town was. And we had just got to the point of enthusiasm where every 10 years we were certain the census taker would have forgotten half our population. Old Mac Sturgis, who owned the Bugle Gazette, then carried on something awful in an editorial when they printed in the almanac that we had a population of only 3,263. We were all pretty riled about it, which should have been 3,500 apparently. We were proud of plenty of other things too. We had good reason to brag about the McClellan House, which was the finest hotel in the county, and I mind when you could get a room and board with apple pie for breakfast every morning for $2 a week. We were proud of our old county families that came over the mountains when Braddock's army was scalped by the Indians in 1775 and settled down in log huts to dry their wounds. But most of all, we were proud of our legal batteries. Son, it was a grand assembly. Mind, I won't say that all of them were long on knowledge in the statute books, but they knew their Blackstone and their Greenleaf on evidence, and they were powerful speakers. And there were some, the top notchers, full of graces and book knowledge and dignity, who were heck on the exact letter of the law. Scottish, Irish, Presbyterians, all of us who loved a good debate and a bottle of whiskey. There was Charlie Connell, a Harvard graduate and the district attorney who had fine hands and wore a fine high collar and made such pathetic addresses to the jury that his people flocked for miles according to hear him. Though he mostly lost his cases, there was Judge Hunt, who prided himself on his resemblance to Abe Lincoln and in consequence always wore a frock coat and an elegant plug hat. Why, there was your own grandfather, who had over 200 books in his library, and people used to go up nights to borrow volumes of the encyclopedia. You know, the big stone courthouse at the top of the street with the flowers around it and the jail adjoining. People went there as they go to the picture shows nowadays. It was a lot better too. Well, from there it was only 2 minutes walk across the meadow to Jim Riley's saloon. All the legal cronies gathered there in the back room, of course, where Jim and an elegant brass spittoon. Oh, Jim had an elegant brass spittoon and a picture of George Washington on the wall to make it dignified. You could see the footpath worn across the grass until they built over that meadow. Beside the usual crowd, there was Bob Moran, the sheriff, a fine, strapping big fellow, but very nervous about doing his duty strictly. And there was poor old Neighbors, a big, quiet, reddish-eyed fellow, who had been a doctor before he took to drink. He was always broke, and he had 2 daughters, one of them consumptive, and Jim Riley pitied him so much that he gave him all he wanted to drink for nothing. Those were fine, happy days, with a power of eloquence and theorizing and solving the problems of the nation in the back room, until our wives came to fetch us home. Then Randall Frazier was murdered, and there was heck to pay. Now, if it had been anybody else but Fred Jolliffe who killed him, naturally we wouldn't have convicted. You can't do it, son. Not in a little community. It's all very well to talk about the power and grandeur of justice, and sounds fine in a speech, but here's somebody you've seen walking the streets about his business every day for years, and you know when his kids were born and saw him crying when one of them died, and you remember how he loaned you $10 when you needed it. Well, you can't take that person out in the cold light of day and string him up by the neck until he's dead. You'll always be seeing the look on his face afterwards, and you'll find excuses for him no matter what he did. But with Fred Jolliffe, it was different. Fred Jolliffe was the worst, nastiest customer we'd ever had, with the possible exception of Randall Frazier himself. Even seen a copperhead curled up on a flat... Oh, ever seen a copperhead curled up on a flat stone? And the copperhead's worse than a rattlesnake. That won't strike unless you step on it, and gives warning before it does. Fred Jolliffe had the same brownish color and sliding movements. You always remember his cart through town. He had some sort of rag and bone business. You understand. You'd see him sitting up there, a skinny little man in a brown coat, peeping round the side of his nose to find something for gossip and grinning. It wasn't merely the things he said about people behind their backs, or to their faces for that matter, because he relied on the fact that he was too small to be thrashed. He was a slick customer. It was believed that he wrote those anonymous letters that caused, but never mind that anyway. I can tell you that this little smirk did drive Will Farmer crazy one time, and Will did beat him within an inch of his life. Will's livery stable was burned down one night about a month later, with 11 horses inside, but nothing could ever be proved. He was too smart for us. That brings me to Fred Jolliffe's only companion. I don't mean friend. Randall Frazier. had a had a harness and saddle store in Main Street. A dusty place with a big dummy horse in the window. I reckon the only thing in the world Randall liked was that dummy horse, which was a dappled mare with vicious-looking glass eyes. He used to keep its mane combed. Randall was a big man with a fine mustache and a horseshoe pin in his tie, and sporty checked clothes. He was buttery polite, and mean as sin. He thought a dirty trick or a swindle was the funniest joke he ever heard, but the women liked him, a lot of them. It's no use denying. Sneaked in at the back door of that harness store. Randall itched to tell it at the barber shop, or show what fools they were, and how virile he was, but he had to be cheerful. He and Fred Jolliffe did a lot of drinking together. Then the news came. It was in October, I think, and I heard it in the morning when I was getting on my hat to go down to the office. Old Withers was the town constable then. He got up early in the morning, although there was no need for it, and when he had gone down Market Street in the mist about 5 o'clock, he saw the gas still burning in the back room of Randall's store. The front door was wide open. Withers went in and found Randall lying on a pile of harnesses in his shirt sleeves, his forehead and face bashed in with a wedging mallet. There wasn't much left of the face, but you could recognize him by his mustache and his horseshoe pin. I was in my office when somebody yelled up from the street that they found Fred Jolliffe drunk and asleep in the flour mill, with blood on his hands and an empty bottle of Randall Fraser's whiskey in his pocket. He was still in bad shape and couldn't walk or understand what was going on. When the sheriff, that was Bob Moran I told you about, came to take him to the lockup, Bob had to drive him in his own rag and bone cart. I saw them drive up Market Street in the rain, Fred lying on his back in the cart, all white with flour, and rolling and cursing. People were very quiet. They were pleased, but they couldn't show it. That is, all except Will Farmer, who had owned the livery stable that was burned down. "Now you'll hang him," said Will. "Now, by goodness, they'll hang him." It's a funny thing, son. I didn't realize the force of that until I heard Judge Hunt pronounce sentence after the trial. They appointed me to defend him because I was a young man without any particular practice, and somebody had to do it. The evidence was all over town before I got a chance to speak with Fred. You could see he was done for. A scissor grinder who lived across the street, I forget his name now, had seen Fred go into Randall's place about 11 o'clock. An odd couple who lived up over the store had heard him drinking and yelling downstairs. At near on midnight, they heard a noise like a fight and a fall, but they knew better than to interfere. Finally, a couple of farmers driving home from town at midnight had seen Fred stumble out of the front door, slapping his clothes and wiping his hands on his coat like a man with delirium tremens. I went to see Fred at the jail. He was sober, although he jerked a good deal. Those pale eyes of his were as poisonous as ever. I could still see him sitting on the bunk in his cell, sucking a brown paper cigarette, wriggling his neck and jeering at me. He wouldn't tell me anything because he said I wouldn't go and tell the judge if he did. "Hang me," he said, and wrinkled his nose and jeered again. "Hang me? Don't you worry about that, mister. Them so-and-sos will never hang me. They're too much afraid of me. Them so-and-sos are, mister? And the fool couldn't get it through his head right up until the sentence. He strutted away in court, making remarks and threatening to tell what he knew about people and calling the judge by his first name. He wore a new Dickie shirt front he bought to look spruce in. I was surprised how quietly everyone took it. The people who came to the trial didn't whisper or shove. They just sat still as death and looked at him. All you could hear was a kind of breathing. It's funny about the courtroom, son. It has its own particular smell, which won't bother you unless you get to thinking about what it means. But you notice worn places and cracks in the walls more than you would anywhere else. You would hear Charlie Connell's voice for the persecution, a little thin sound in a big room, and Charlie's footsteps creaking. You would hear the cough in the audience, or a woman's dress rustle, or the gas jets whistling in the dark. It was dark in the rainy season, and they lit the gas jets by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. ... Okay. The only defense I could make was that Fred had been too drunk to be responsible and remembered nothing of the night, which he admitted was true. But in addition to being no defense in law, it was a terrible frost. It was a terrible frost besides. My own voice sounded wrong. I remember that 6 of the jury had whiskers and 6 hadn't, and Judge Hunt, up on the bench with the flag draped on the wall behind his head, looked more like Abraham Lincoln than ever. Even Fred Jolliffe began to notice. He kept twitching round to look at the people a little uneasy-like. Once he stuck out his neck at the jury and screeched, "Say something, can't ya? Do something, can't ya?" They did. When the foreman of the jury said guilty of murder in the first degree, there was just a little noise from those people. Not a cheer or anything like that. It hissed out altogether. Only once, like breath released, but it was terrible to hear. It didn't hit Fred until Judge Hunt was halfway through pronouncing sentence. Fred stood looking round with a wild, half-witted expression until he heard Judge Hunt say, "And may God have mercy on your soul." Then he burst out kind of pleading and kiddling, as though as though this was carrying the joke too far, and said, "Listen now, you don't mean that, do you? You can't fool me. You're only Jerry Hunt. I know who you are. You can't do that to me." All of a sudden, he began pounding the table and screaming, "You ain't really a-going to hang me, are you?" But we were. The date of the execution was fixed for the 12th of November. The order was all signed within the precincts of the said county jail between the hours of 8 and 9 a.m. The said Frederick Jolliffe shall be hanged by the neck until he is dead. An executioner is to be commissioned by the sheriff for this purpose, that the sentence to be carried out in the presence of a qualified medical practitioner. The body is to be interred, and the rest of it. Everyone was nervous. There had never been a hanging since any of that crowd had been in office, and nobody knew how to go about it exactly. Old Doc McDonald, the coroner, was to be there, and of course they got a hold of Reverend Phillips, the preacher, and Bob Moran's wife was going to cook pancakes and sausages for the last breakfast. Maybe you think that's fool talk, but think for a minute of taking somebody you've known all your life and binding his arms one cold morning and walking him out in your own backyard to crack his neck on a rope, all religious and legal, with not a soul to interfere. Then you begin to get scared of the powers of life and death and the thin partition between. Bob Moran was scared white for fear things wouldn't go off properly. He had appointed big, slow-moving, tipsy Ed Neighbors as hangman. This was partially because Ed Neighbors needed the $50, and partly because Bob had a vague idea that an ex-medical man would be better able to manage an execution. Ed had sworn to keep sober. Bob Moran said he wouldn't get a dime unless he was sober, but you couldn't always tell. Neighbors seemed in earnest. He had studied up the manner of scientific hanging in an old book he borrowed from your grandfather, and he and the carpenter had knocked together a big, shaky-looking contraption in the jail yard. It worked all right in practice, with sacks of meal rather. The trap went down with a boom and brought your heart up in your throat. But once they allowed for too much spring in the rope, and it tore a sack apart. Then old Doc McDonald chipped in about that fellow John Leo in England, and it nearly finished Bob Moran. That was late on the night before the execution. We were sitting around the lamp in Bob's office trying to play stud poker. There were tops and skipping ropes of all kinds of toys all over that office. Bob let his kids play in there, which he shouldn't have done because the door out of it led to a corridor of cells with Fred Jolliffe in the last one. Of course, the few other prisoners, disorderlies, and chicken thieves, and the like had been moved upstairs. Somebody had told Bob that the scent of an execution affects him, like a cage of wild animals. Whoever it was, he was right. We could hear him shifting and stamping over our heads, and one colored boy singing hymns all night long. Well, it was raining hard on the thin roof. Maybe that was what put Doc McDonald in mind of it. Doc was a cynical old devil when he saw that Bob couldn't sit still and would throw in his hand whenever, or without even looking at the buried card. Doc said, "Yes, I hope it'll go off all right, but you want to be careful about that rain. Did you read about the fellow that they tried to hang in England, and the rain had swelled the boards so the trap wouldn't fall? They stuck him on it 3 times, but still it wouldn't work." Ed Neighbors slammed his hand down on the table. I reckon he felt bad enough as it was, because one of his daughters had run away and left him, and the other was dying of consumption. But he was twitchy and reddish about the eyes. He hadn't had a drink for 2 days, although there was a bottle on the table, he says. "You shut up or I'll kill you, darn you, McDonald," he said, and grabs the edge of the table. "I tell you nothing can go wrong. I'll go out and test the thing again, if you let me put the rope around your neck." And Bob Moran says, "What do you want to talk like that for anyways, Doc? Ain't it bad enough as it is?" he said. "Now you've got me worrying about something else," he said. "I went down there a while ago to look at him, and he said the funniest thing I ever heard." Fred Jolliffe said, "He's crazy." He giggled and said God wouldn't let them so-and-so hang him. It was terrible, hearing Fred Jolliffe talk like that. "What time is it, somebody?" It was cold that night. I dozed off in a chair, hearing the rain and that animal cage shuffling upstairs. The colored boy was singing that part of the hymns about while the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high. They woke me about 8:30 to say that Judge Hunt and all the witnesses were out in the jail yard, and they were ready to start the march. When I realized that they were really going to hang him after all, I had to join behind the procession, as I was sworn, but I didn't see Fred Jolliffe's face, and I didn't want to see it. They had given him a good wash and a clean flannel shirt, that they tucked under at the neck. He stumbled coming out of the cell and started to go in the wrong direction, but Bob Moran and the constable each had him by one arm. It was a cold, dark, windy morning. His hands were tied behind. The preacher was saying something I couldn't catch, and everything was off smoothly enough until they got halfway across the jail yard. It's a pretty big yard, and I didn't look at the contraption in the middle, but at the witness stand, at the witness standing over against the wall with their hats off. But Fred Jolliffe did look at it and went down on his knees. They hauled him up again. I heard them keep on walking and go up the steps, which were creaky. I didn't look at the contraption until I heard the thumping sound, and we all knew something was wrong. And that's a good place to stop, I guess. Oh, yeah. About halfway through the story. So, anyways, we have been reading Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Stories Not for the Nervous, and we have been reading The Other Hangman by Carter Dickson. We still have quite a few pages to do of this story, but we are making good time, I think. Let's see, there are still 5 stories left, which isn't bad. Anyways, if you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, or if you want to join the Discord server, then all the information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.